There is something profoundly unsettling about stories that turn back on their creators, that consume the very mind which conceived them. A Slight Case of Murder, an episode of Tales from the Crypt, is one such story, an elegant and cruel meditation on the psychology of guilt, vanity, and the seductive power of fiction. On its surface, it is a murder tale with all the hallmarks of noir: an aging crime novelist, a mysterious visitor, a house filled with shadows and secrets. Yet beneath that familiar pulp exterior lies an examination of how the act of storytelling itself can become a weapon of destruction. This is not just a tale about killing. It is about the way an imagination unmoored from conscience becomes a trap from which there is no escape. The first frame introduces us to Harold Logan, a once celebrated writer whose books line the walls of his home like epitaphs to a career long past. The room is cloaked in half-light, the glow from a flickering lamp illuminating dust motes that hang in the air like ghosts of former acclaim. Harold sits in his chair, glass in hand, the kind of drinker who nurses his whiskey not for pleasure but for survival. His eyes are red, his typewriter silent. The room hums with a quiet desperation that feels more haunting than any supernatural presence. He mutters to himself, rehearsing lines, re-editing phrases no one will read. Then comes the sound that disrupts his fragile peace, a knock on the door. It is a gentle, polite sound, but in a world as decayed as Harold's, it might as well be thunder. The visitor is a young woman named Claire, radiant yet disarming in her curiosity. She claims to be a graduate student writing about crime fiction and the psychology of killers. The conversation between them unfolds like a duel disguised as an interview. At first, Harold revels in her attention. He is flattered, seduced by the idea that someone still cares about his work, about the complex morality of his stories. But as she probes deeper, asking questions that touch too closely on his private life, his discomfort grows. She brings up his early novels, the ones filled with obscure references to unsolved crimes. She asks about his late wife, whose mysterious disappearance was never explained. Each question is an incision, and the more she presses, the more the facade of literary mastery begins to crumble. "You write about murder as though you've seen it," she says, smiling gently. He laughs, though it sounds forced. "Writers see everything," he replies, trying to regain control, but in that moment the balance of power shifts. Claire is no longer a fan, she is an accuser in disguise. What Tales from the Crypt does so masterfully here is craft a psychological labyrinth where the line between interview and interrogation blurs, and where every word spoken becomes a clue to the truth Harold has buried. The cinematography amplifies this tension. The camera often frames Harold through the narrow slats of his bookshelves or the reflection in his whiskey glass, emphasizing his entrapment. Every object in the room, every page, every photo, every bottle seems to be watching him. Even his typewriter, silent but waiting, looms like a witness. As the night deepens, Harold grows convinced that Claire knows too much. She quotes lines from his unpublished drafts, describes scenes from his books that were never printed. When he demands to know how she obtained them, she merely smiles and says, "You mailed them to me." The words land like a curse. Suddenly, Harold's carefully compartmentalized world begins to fracture. He accuses her of blackmail. She denies it, but her calmness only enrages him further. "You think I'm just another story for you to finish," she says quietly, "but you already finished it." There is a brief silence then, the kind that feels like the moment before lightning strikes. Harold lunges toward her, and the screen cuts to black. When it fades back, we see him alone, shaking, covered in sweat. A broken glass lies at his feet. The room is still. He tells himself it was an accident, that she slipped. He drags her body to the study, wraps her in an old curtain, and hides her in the cellar. The entire sequence is filmed without music, only the sound of his breath and the creak of the stairs. The horror is not in the act, but in the methodical calm with which he performs it. He narrates to himself as if writing a story. The author acted in self-defense. The girl attacked first. Each sentence is both justification and damnation. When he finally sits at his typewriter, it begins to type on its own. The keys strike rhythmically, spelling words he does not intend. She's not dead. The message terrifies him. He rips the paper from the machine, but another sheet slides in, continuing the sentence, "She's waiting." The typewriter becomes the voice of his guilt, mechanical and unstoppable. He smashes it, but the damage is done. His imagination, once his tool, now controls him completely. He begins hearing footsteps in the hall, sees shadows moving in the corners of the room. The lighting shifts subtly from warm to cold until the entire space feels like a tomb. When he finally dares to return to the cellar, the curtain is empty. No body, no blood, no trace of her remains. His mind collapses under the weight of uncertainty. He rushes to the phone to call the police but stops mid-dial, realizing what he would have to confess. Then the phone rings by itself. He answers. It's Claire's voice, calm and steady. "You forgot the ending." At this point, the story transforms from crime thriller to psychological horror. The question of whether Claire is alive or a projection of Harold's guilt becomes irrelevant. The real terror lies in the collapse of his narrative control. Every writer constructs order out of chaos, but Harold's chaos has become the only order he can perceive. The script blurs into life. The murderer becomes the protagonist, and the protagonist becomes his own victim. The next morning, the police arrive after a neighbor reports screams. Harold greets them politely, dressed, calm, almost cheerful. He offers them tea, insists there has been a misunderstanding. They find the cellar empty but discover pages scattered across his desk, a manuscript titled A Slight Case of Murder. It describes every detail of the night before, down to the words spoken, the angle of the blow, the disappearance of the body. The officers exchange glances, unsure whether to treat it as evidence or madness. When one asks if it's fiction, Harold smiles faintly. "Isn't everything?" he replies. That line seals his fate. As they lead him away, he looks back at his study one last time, where the typewriter sits gleaming under a shaft of light. The carriage moves on its own, typing the final sentence. The author confessed, though no one asked him to. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience in the uneasy space between explanation and nightmare. What makes A Slight Case of Murder so haunting is that it refuses resolution. We never learn what is real, and we don't need to. The story is not about truth, but about the madness that arises when truth and fiction merge. Harold's crime is not only murder but arrogance, the arrogance of believing that he can rewrite reality the way he rewrites a paragraph. His punishment is poetic, to live forever in a story he cannot finish. The brilliance of this episode lies in its understanding of the storyteller's psychology. Every writer hides fragments of themselves in their work. Regrets, desires, fears. Harold's genius was his ability to disguise confession as entertainment. But confession demands honesty, and when honesty is replaced by performance, guilt festers like a wound. His imagination becomes a courtroom where he plays both judge and accused, condemned to relive his crimes in the endless loop of narrative revision. There is a striking moment near the end when Harold, now confined to a mental institution, continues typing invisible words on an imaginary keyboard. The nurse watches him with pity, unaware that he is still trapped inside the story. His fingers move rhythmically, the echo of typewriter keys filling the silence. The camera pans to a blank page on the desk revealing faint indentations from invisible writing. Even without ink, the words exist. They always will. It's a haunting metaphor for guilt, the way it leaves marks even when we believe we've erased it. The Crypt Keeper's epilogue, typically sardonic, feels here like a moral delivered from the grave. He jokes about writers who kill their characters and then kill themselves trying to fix the ending. But beneath the humor lies truth. A Slight Case of Murder is a tragedy of control, of the artist's eternal battle between invention and confession. The more Harold tries to shape his reality, the more it shapes him. His mind becomes a haunted house where every corridor leads back to the same locked room, the cellar where he buried his conscience. Watching this episode feels like watching a man drown in ink. The deeper he wades into his own story, the less air there is to breathe. The walls close in, the narrative tightens, until the only escape is self-destruction. It's a cautionary tale for anyone who confuses storytelling with absolution, for anyone who believes that the right words can undo the wrong deeds. They can't. Words reveal, they don't erase. What lingers after the credits roll is not fear, but melancholy, a sense that Harold's tragedy could belong to anyone who has ever tried to rewrite their past. There is an echo of empathy beneath the horror, a recognition that guilt is universal, that imagination, while beautiful, is also dangerous when used to deny rather than confront. In that sense, A Slight Case of Murder transcends its genre. It becomes an allegory for the fragility of identity and the peril of unchecked creation. It reminds us that stories are not walls to hide behind, but mirrors to face ourselves in. And sometimes the reflection is too